My name is Tom Kennedy. I am the Director of Membership Operations here at the Battery. And today I am joined by Natalie Nixon and Lauren Schiller for our Leading with Creativity in an Uncertain World talk. So tonight we're going to be discussing how practical creativity techniques can help us navigate ambiguous terrain, shifting mindset, and stretch thinking for life. We hope to gain an alternate lens to view the trajectory of your work and gain inspiration to move forward. We're going to learn how to adapt and disrupt our own thinking for more meaningful outcomes. Natalie, PhD, is a creativity strategist, global keynote speaker, author of the award-winning Creativity Leap, Unleashing Curiosity, Improvisation and Intuition at Work, and has been featured in Forbes and in Fast Company. Lauren is the host and creator of the award-winning nationally syndicated public radio show and podcast Inflection Point, produced in partnership with KALW San Francisco and PRX. Inflection Point is one of the first podcasts ever to report on how women rise up, build power, and lead change. I've started everybody off with their microphones muted. If you do have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat, and we will take those later on. We have about 15 to 20 people. If it's intimate enough, Lauren and Natalie might make the call to unmute, at which point, please by all means unmute and join the chat. But in the meantime, if you could drop any and all questions in the chat, we'll get to them later on. At this point, I will hand it over to Lauren. Welcome, Lauren.
All right. It's so good to see all these faces and folks that I know. So I'm so happy to be here. My name is Lauren Schiller. I am a proud creative in residence at the Battery. And you can find my show at inflectionpointradio.org if you want to learn about how people build power and lead change, specifically women. One very powerful woman is here with me tonight. Her name is Natalie Nixon. She's got a PhD in design management and a totally fascinating background. It turns out we went to college together, but we never knew each other. So we just met at an alumni event where she just completely wowed me with her work around creativity. Natalie's a dancer. She studied anthropology and fashion. She was a professor for 16 years before she pivoted to the work that she does now as a creativity strategist. Natalie's lived all over the world and comes to us today from her home in Philadelphia. Welcome, Natalie.
Thank you, Lauren. It's so good to be here. And thank you, the Battery, for hosting this cool conversation. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And I should mention Natalie has a treat she will share at the end. Tom will be posting a link to download her Wonder Rigor tip sheet in the chat. If you download it, you'll be eligible for the treat to be named. We'll talk more about that later. Okay, let's talk about creativity. In preparing for this conversation and spending a year plus wondering about the nature of it and what gets in your way and what propels you forward, I think of it as a swirl of activity. Like we constantly need to be making and doing and working. And this conversation is not all about the pandemic, but it really was an opportunity to take a pause. And think about what does it mean for me and possibly what does it mean for all of you. So creativity is often thought of as the skill bestowed upon a select few. Natalie has a different take. She believes that we're all equally capable of creativity and innovation, especially if we design systems for ourselves and our workplace in which creativity can thrive. We're all part of a larger system, reflecting and responding to our environment, and that environment can be full of rewards or resistance. So when we got together to talk about what angle could we take for this conversation, what we concluded is that we want to talk about how we can each develop our creativity from the inside out, including building in that time to pause, like not a forced pause that a world pandemic causes you, but one that you create for yourself and hopefully has nicer things happening around it. So we're gonna cover how we can maximize our own creativity, create a culture of creativity at work, and even innovate new solutions for a more equitable society. So we're dreaming big here. Okay, now that I've given you the lay of the land, Tom has a poll that we're gonna launch. It's one simple question. And I'm so curious how you all are gonna answer it, seeing who's here. Do you describe yourself as creative? Watching the results come in. See how many folks we are. All right. All right. I think the yays have it. We have an 89% answer of yes. And 2 of you, 11%, who say, no, you don't describe yourself as creative. So we will get into this. Can everyone see that on the screen? It's my first time using a poll. Very exciting. Okay, stop sharing. So that sounds to me like we have a few bases to cover, including how to supercharge that creativity. So Natalie, why don't we just start with a simple definition of how you define creativity? Because I read in your book that you say most people don't understand creativity, but we have a room full of creatives. So how do you define it? Let's use that as our baseline.
I'm really excited and happy that so many people in this gathering self-describe as creative. And the definition I landed on, and my goal was to come up with a definition of creativity that was accessible and simple, and that hopefully begins to democratize creativity. So I think about creativity as toggling between wonder and rigor to solve problems. Full stop. And sometimes I add on to that and I say that it's about toggling between wonder and rigor to solve problems and produce novel value at scale. And that could be social value, financial value, cultural value, but it's really important to connect the dots between creativity and innovation. That creativity is the engine for innovation.
So I'm curious, given that you actually had a career switch, and have now been doing this work for some time, why is creativity important to you specifically?
In many ways, so I'm a self-described hybrid thinker. I remember in my 20s, I would get really frustrated with my friends who worked on Wall Street, who I believe were pretty condescending about folks who worked in the arts and nonprofit sector, and thought of them as essentially it's kind of naive. And at the same time, I would get kind of frustrated with my friends who worked in the arts and nonprofit sector who looked at people who worked on Wall Street or in corporate America as working for the man. And I always understood the copaestheticness of both of those sectors. I understood the interconnectedness between them. And at the same time, I never had language. I never had a framework. I never had a hook upon which I could hang my hat to really describe this hybridity that I lived, that I felt, that I sensed, and that I embraced. And so fast forward a couple of decades later, it was really in the midst of naively deciding to earn a PhD while working full time, because I thought, how hard could that be? It's just a big paper at the end. That I discovered this field called design management, design strategy. And here was this incredibly hybrid and integrative approach to the way we could think about strategy and business and organizations and creativity. And so that began the ways that I slowly but surely began to be able to articulate creativity. I have a traditional link to creativity because I studied dance since I was age 4. And in my view, we tend to ghettoize creativity in the arts. We tend to silo creativity in the arts, and that's not fair to artists, and it's not beneficial to our society at large. Then after doing this PhD, I launched a strategic design MBA program at the university where I taught. So now I'm playing around with this idea of trying to creatively disrupt graduate business school education. And in fact, we called that executive MBA program the MBA for hybrid thinkers. And we integrated design thinking into how people learn strategy and leadership and finance and branding, et cetera. And then, so I'm explaining all this because just to kind of show you my journey of inching closer and closer to having a framing of really leading with creativity and starting with creativity, aside and apart from a more traditional understanding of it as a dancer. So then after launching this strategic design MBA program, I do a TEDx Philadelphia talk where I basically was proclaiming that the future of work is jazz. Here's how and why. And I start getting invited into companies to help them design improvisational teams and become more improvisational. And essentially what was starting to happen was I was really being invited in to companies to help them build cultures of innovation. And that's when I started figure eight thinking, really as my side hustle. I was still a full-time academic and professor, looked up about a year after launching figure eight thinking as a side hustle and realized I'm kind of having more fun with my side hustle. And still, as I'm getting these engagements to build cultures of innovation, I just had this creeping sensation that we were starting in the wrong place. Everyone throws around the I word. Everyone wants to be innovative. We're kind of missing each other, even in how we're defining innovation, which, by the way, I think of innovation as an invention converted into scalable value. And that conversion factor is creativity. And we can talk more about that. I have a fun example about how that has shown up recently. But you know, it was really inch by inch as I was being asked to help people manifest innovation that it became clearer and clearer to me that we needed to really start with creativity. And you can hear even through my definition of creativity that I still have latched on to this very hybrid approach, this very integrative yin yang, dare I say, chaotic way of thinking about creativity, that we need both the wonder and the rigor.
Well, I want to talk more about the wonder and the rigor, and I'm going to interrupt myself before I ask you the next question to say, since we have so many people who have identified themselves as creative, I'm really curious what creative field you're all in, and if you have a second to just type it into the chat, I think it would be a great. You can send it to everyone, or you can just send it. Yeah, send it to everyone so Natalie and I can see it, and everyone can see who's here.
Yes,
would love to know. So, okay, so
sorry, and Lauren, can I just add that even for the 2 people, the 11% who don't self-describe as creative,
yes,
you know, part of, I would argue that if we dug a little deeper, unpacked it a bit, if you want to embrace my way of thinking about creativity, you are in fact creative. The best engineers, the most impactful attorneys, the best farmers, teachers, estheticians are hyper creative or super creative because they are constantly toggling between wonder and rigor to solve problems. And wonder is about awe and deep curiosity and audacity and asking big blue sky what if questions, which is typically where we stop when we think about creativity, right? We're like, oh, it's this woo-woo loopy thing out there. It's, you know, that's what being creative is about, right? But no, it also requires the rigor, which is about discipline and focus and time on task. And it's often very solitary work, and it's not particularly sexy. And if you have been kind of equating creativity with the arts, and you have in your own background, in your own practice, some link to the arts, you totally recognize that, right? You recognize that before you get to do the jetés across the stage, there is this grind of repetition, and it's not fun, and it's sweaty and gritty, or you got to practice your scales over and over and over again before, you know, you can be the virtuoso pianist. So we know this, and yet when we just kind of chuck off creativity as this addendum to the really important stuff. So if people leave with nothing else after tonight's conversation, just to ponder that a bit and just start to observe in your own life and work where you begin to see the two either coming together, wonder and rigor, or the two needing to come together a bit more.
I love that, and I hope that nobody felt that it was a trick question.
No, hope not. No,
because there are so many places in your life to be creative, and many of us spend most of our awakened hours in a work environment, and so that feels like the place where we would either have the most opportunity to be creative or the least, and then we have to reserve our creativity for something that we do in the off hours, and to have those two things live in separate worlds. And it seems like what you're arguing is that you can actually take the way that you think about creativity and apply it across those worlds.
I'm arguing that you can take it and apply across those worlds. And I'm also arguing, I'll take a step further, that it is imperative that you do so. And that, you know, when I was writing the book, I thought, oh gosh, you know, is it a luxury to be creative? Am I just going on and on about stuff that, you know, when you don't know how you're going to pay your light bill, right? You just want your kids to have a great education. You don't have access to great healthcare. Like like, is this a first world problem sort of thing, right? But then, you know, and if you read the book, if you read The Creativity Leap, then you'll see I pull from some culturally specific references. I interviewed over 50 people who come from technology, science, law, farmers. I interviewed our family plumber, all sorts of people. But I also had some very culturally specific references that relate to my culture. I'm African American. So I come from a culture where creativity has been the fundamental stepping stone for radical transformation, for foresight, for the ability to identify a future state that looks, when the current state is a dystopia, right? So if you look at jazz music, America's classical music, if you look at, I talk in the book about how in the 1980s in our country, the early 80s, we were witness to one of the biggest divestments of funding for arts education in the American public schools. And that disproportionately affected poor Black kids in urban Philly, I said Philly, I'm from Philly, urban public schools. And so, you know, to this point, is creativity a luxury? Well, what did some young Black male teenagers do? They turned a turntable into a percussion instrument, and the scratch became one of the most iconic sounds in hip hop music. And hip hop today is the world's largest genre of music. There are so many other examples in addition to art that are more about strategy. I think about Harriet Tubman, who liberated hundreds of enslaved African Americans, but really in large part because of her intelligence, but also because of her intuition. She paid attention to her dreams, for example. She was an incredible navigator. She was a spy for the Union Army. These were all capabilities that I think about as part of creativity. So when I say that creativity is an imperative, we actually cannot afford not to be creative. And I think the COVID quarantine really elevated and revealed all sorts of ways that people became really creative because they had to. You know, creativity loves constraints on time, constraints on money, constraints on people talent. And so in so many organizations and so many touch points in people's personal lives, because of those constraints, they became uber creative, toggling between wonder and rigor to solve problems.
So thinking about the constraints and thinking about the things that you actually need in your life to enable you to be free to create, what are some of the systems that you recommend people set up for themselves, either for you know, doing what they want to do on a regular basis, or in those moments when it's just not coming to you?
Yeah. So I think I like to think on, and I mentioned this to you, Lauren, in one of our earlier conversations. You and I both know Eve Rodsky, who's the author of the New York Times bestseller Fair Play.
Good plug.
And even I both love talking about the space-time continuum. I'm a big 2x2 nerd. I love like figuring things out through frameworks and 2x2s. And we can design in the space, our physical environment. And I don't care if it's, you know, getting back to this creativity luxury, I don't care if it's a space you can carve out in a closet, or if you have the privilege of tons of space where you can design zones to dream, and also for quiet and for rigor. So we can design in the space, and we also need to design in the time. Now, unfortunately, that is one of the biggest pain points that I see in organizations, of not designing in the time to allow people to wonder, to allow people to experience awe. It's impossible to wonder when you're going 80 miles an hour. And yet we do Zoom Palooza, we're churning through meetings. We look up and suddenly we're being disrupted by this new upstart organization or company. It's because we're not designing in the space or the time. So for example, Google used to do something called 20% time. They don't do it anymore, but they used to do something called 20% time, where 20% of the work week, like every fifth day, they would allow people to tinker and explore and just kind of ponder into something that wasn't part of their P&L. It wasn't part of their literal job description. One of the things that was birthed because of the 20% time to do that deep thought, tinkering work is Gmail. Another thing that was birthed out of that is the DEI practice at Google. Another example, Amtrak. This might be admittedly the one thing I do like about Amtrak, because it is a monopoly, and there's all sorts of things that come with Amtrak being a monopoly. But one thing I really love that Amtrak did, which was just a really beautifully exploratory offering. They had a call for writers' residencies on the train. Because you think about it, how much great thinking and pondering, wondering and daydreaming you can get done on a train. So I don't know how many tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of entries and applications they had to go through. But what if, as a writer, or maybe you've been wanting to write, what if you could have this residency on the Pacific Rail route, right? And that's the sort of these are the sorts of opportunities that we can design in to our lives to make the space and time for creativity.
What about, I want to talk about the role of the pause. Because this idea, this society that we live in is so focused on productivity and making and doing and buying and consuming, and is that really all there is? And I think that there's this question that you're starting to look into around, what if we just pause, and
Yes.
not necessarily for days or months or years, but maybe for 5 minutes?
That's correct. Yeah. That's the other thing. We create these barriers to entry when it comes to being creative, when it comes to engaging in a process that is admittedly super ambiguous, right? But one of the things, the book is written and designed in such a way where each chapter ends with a creativity leap tip for the individual and for the organization. And a tip that I practice daily, and which I really encourage others to do, is I take regular daydream breaks. And sometimes I can only afford a 90-second daydream break. Sometimes I can afford a 5-minute daydream break. Sometimes it's 15 minutes, but usually it's between 90 seconds and 5 minutes. And what is just so fascinating to me is that I always return to the work at hand more energized, a bit more clarity. A new idea has emerged out of my brain, from the depths of my brain, that helped me to return to the work at hand with renewed interest and renewed energy. And that's because we're only optimizing probably 20-30% of our brain. And we tend to focus on kind of the frontal lobe, and there's all these other regions of the brain that are important for deep immersive thought, in order to give that other kind of linear focused thought a rest and a break. And after I wrote the book, while I talk about intuition and write about intuition in the book, I've started, especially really actually through the quarantine, of getting very interested in how we are physiologically wired to need pauses. And I've become really, I'm an anthropologist. I'm very interested in different cultures. I think it's fascinating how so many world religions have built into their worldview, into their theology, rest and pause. And Judaism, there's the seventh day is the Sabbath. In academia, if you're lucky, every 7 years you get to take a sabbatical. I'm part of a new initiative that launches this winter called Sabbatigo, Sabatigo. It's recruiting corporations who are willing to invest in folks who they realize are kind of teetering towards burnout. And it's 2 weeks in Berlin this November. It's going to be 2 weeks in Paris in April, which, that admittedly, these are luxuries, but it doesn't have to be expensive. It does have to be consistent, and it does have to be regular. But getting back to our physiology, one of the things we know is that we have the second longest nerve in our bodies is the vagus nerve. The first longest nerve is our spinal cord, which is actually an extension of the brain. And the vagus nerve extends from your cranium down through your heart into your gut. So when we say things like, my gut is telling me, it kind of is, it literally is, because we are wired physiologically to connect mind, heart, and gut. And then I started exploring a bit more the autonomic nervous system. So we have the sympathetic nervous system, which is, our heart's beat without us, thankfully, without us having to monitor that. Our digestive systems get to work without us having to monitor that. That's the sympathetic nervous system. But then there's the parasympathetic nervous system, which includes the vagus nerve, and it includes fight, flight, and it includes breed, greed. And what's required for the parasympathetic nervous system to really be optimized? Rest. And I'm not talking about meditation, because meditation requires a certain amount of intentional focus. I'm talking about daydreaming, sleeping, just like in Philly, hanging out on the front stoop, so this matters. And it's my hope. So here's my observation. In a world where we now know we can work from anywhere, we can learn from anywhere, and we are in the fourth industrial revolution, where tech is ubiquitous, the train has left the station, AI, robotics, it's all here, AR, VR, et cetera, right? In a world where we know we can now work from anywhere, it's my perspective that those companies and those organizations that work at the intersection of tech, productivity, and meaningful human experience are going to be the ones that thrive. The challenge is that most organizations have 2 out of those 3, right. Most don't have meaningful human connection down, and especially because of this interface that we're, working through right now, the digital interface. So I'm biased, but I believe that it's creativity that's going to be the through line that will help to interlink productivity, meaningful productivity, digital technology, and experience, all towards the goal of well-being. It's my view that creativity is a productivity play, creativity is a well-being play, and creativity is most definitely a way to optimize the human. Because now that we know that basic tasks can be taken over by robots and AI and such, the organizations, the leaders, the teams that will flourish and thrive will be the ones that make more room for the human to show up. That's really the opportunity, and that's the goal, which is why, coming a little bit full circle, why creativity is so imperative. It's not a nice to have anymore. It's really a must have.
Yeah. I kind of want to just say hallelujah.
Yeah, right.
It's
Kind
so
of the silver
powerful.
lining. I hope we all get that.
I also want to give a shout out to Tiffany Schlane, whose face I was seeing on this conversation earlier. There she is, who has written an entire book about taking a day
I know,
off.
Natalie, we got to talk. I wrote a whole book called 24/6, and I write all about the parasympathetic nervous system. So I'd love to
I'm
talk
going to
about
read your book. Thank you. I
I'll
always
hook you two up.
So friend, befriend, rest. I just thank you. I'm
Well,
right.
you know, I love, okay. Yeah, I mean, for 11 years, my family and I turn off all screens for what we call our tech Shabbat. And I feel most creative, and I'm a filmmaker, so I really track it. But my most creative day by far is Saturday, when all the screens are off and I'm daydreaming and in nature. And so anyways, I'm loving everything you're saying, and I'd love to connect afterwards.
I would love that, Tiffany.
We'll make it happen. We'll make it happen.
And speaking of like a tech Shabbat, our daughter, the first time she announced that I think she was an 8th grader. I don't think she was in 9th grade yet. Middle school sucks. I don't know about you. It's hard. I would never ever go back to that time of life. And it was hard for her. And she's a tween in the middle of being a digital native, where there's constantly, like, I didn't know I wasn't invited to the party on Monday. Like, I just got to school. It was like, right. Oh, those people are talking at the lunch table, right? Like, I had no idea I wasn't invited, right? But now you're constantly aware of it's FOMO on steroids, right? So, but she announced to us at one point, I'm going on a tech fast. Right? Wait, what? I was like, Sid, what's that? And she said, I just took myself off Instagram for a while. I don't really want to, it just makes me feel bad when I see that I'm at certain parties. I was like, wow, that's so amazing.
That's so self-aware.
And now she's going to her junior year in college. And she just recently said, yeah, I just unsubscribed to Snapchat. I realized, like, she said, I knew I had to catch myself when I was like almost stumbled down the stairs because I was like looking at my screen. Right. So, but I'm also increasingly aware that, you know, I'm Gen X, I'm solidly middle-aged, and so many of us take this long to really understand what really matters. And what if we could equip our children, people younger than us, that of assuaging their fears of needing to have the most jam-packed resume and all these things, because it's not sustainable otherwise. It's otherwise not sustainable.
Yeah, and that travels with you into adulthood, and it doesn't leave you the space that you need to ask questions the way you just actually framed that question, which is started with the words, what if?
Yeah.
What if? So I wanted to get back to this idea, this question of seeing a world that doesn't exist. You said that a few minutes ago. I'm looking at the work that that many of these people attending here tonight do: photographer, lawyer, design, fabric arts, architect, filmmaker, communications and marketing, architecture, biotech. The list goes on. These are all fields, I would argue, where you have to see a world that doesn't exist in order to create that world. So how, and we each have our own methodologies, I'm sure, but what are some of the kind of must remembers to imagine a new kind of world, whether it's innovation at work, or I'm really interested in the topic of social change right now. How do we project forward? What's the state of mind that we need to be in order to be asking that question, what if, and imagine a different kind of future?
Well, so first I just want to shout out to the lawyer, because I'm married to an attorney who has a very different type of beautiful brain. He has, he does that sexy law. He's an ERISA tax benefits lawyer. So watch out now. And
so was Ruth Bader Ginsburg's husband, right?
Yeah. Okay. And executive compensation. Like he wrote that like size 2 font stuff, all that, but here's what I have learned through him being my husband, my friend, in our marriage, and what I get to observe seeing him at work. When we first met, he said to me, I'm not like you. You love what you do. He said, I'm really good at what I do, but I like it. I don't love it. And I said, well, if you could do anything, what would you want to do? And he said, without, skipping to me, he said, I'd love to be a therapist. I was like, well, why don't you? He said, I'm too lazy to go back to school. So what's really cool now, fast forward, we've been married 12 years, is that he gets to be a therapist because he does executive comp work, right? But here's what's so interesting. He is super creative because he has to combine his legal training, which really, and I'm really dumbing this down, this is the Cliff Notes version of law school, 3 years of law school, but you learn to understand a problem from like 20 different angles, right? That's paradigm shifting. That's like having a systems view. That's systems design, in my view. That's being able to unpack something to its lowest common denominator, lay it all on the table, and then understand, based on all of those components, how might we approach the problem? And not only how might we approach the problem, how's the other party going to approach the problem? He's incredible EQ, in part because he's the youngest of 3 older sisters. So in order to stay in the room, he had to shut up and be quiet.
EQ being emotional intelligence, emotional quotient?
EQ being emotional intelligence. I've benefited a lot from his high EQ. But, so shout out to lawyers and hopefully this lawyer who's here self-described as creative, because totally, yes. To be an attorney requires an immense amount of creativity. But to answer your question, Lauren, about, I'm going to paraphrase it, but how do we go about the work of ensuring we're creative? Did I say that right, Lauren?
I'm going to simplify it down to, how do we see a world that doesn't exist?
How do we see a world that doesn't exist? I would offer up another part of my creativity ecosystem, which is the 3 I's, because I figured it's not enough just to tell people, oh, toggle between wonder and rigor to solve problems. Off you go, you're creative. It's like, well, how do you intentionally keep doing that? How do you exercise it and practice that? And I believe it's through the 3 I's, which are inquiry, improvisation, and intuition. So how do we see a world that does not yet exist? We got to get really good at asking questions. We got to take away the fear of asking questions, the shaming that so many of us have experienced through our learning environments or the educational system that some of us grew up in, where you didn't want to feel stupid. I think I'm being really blunt right now, so I hope it's okay, but I went through 3 different types of educational environments by the time I graduated from high school. I started in urban Philly public school. You had to know how to fight. I went to suburban public school where I was called the N-word for the first 2 weeks of school. And then I went to hoity-toity elitist Quaker prep school, 7th through 12th grade. And one of the greatest gifts that the white boys in physics at 11th grade gave me was that when you're loud and wrong, the world does not come to a screeching halt. Because I was the girl who would go over my answers 3 times. I would eventually raise my hand and quietly kind of say the answer. And the guys in the back would blurt something out and it was wrong. And the teacher would say, not what I was looking for, but let's understand how you came to that answer. And what's another way we could think about it, right? So I was educating 2 very different systems. The first 6 years of education, first, whatever that is, 1st through 6th grade, I was being taught to stay in your lane, fill in the dot, do well on the test, get gold stars. I was really good at giving the teacher what they wanted. And then I went to an environment, it was ask a better freaking question. Ask for forgiveness, not permission. And as a Black girl in those environments, that was a mind trip because there was so much that I was navigating. And in order to see a future that doesn't exist, we have to be bold and courageous to ask different questions. We have to, even sometimes when we're not given the permission to, we must at least whisper them, begin to utter them. And Warren Berger, who's the author of A More Beautiful Question, would even argue, we need to teach how to ask questions. He calls himself a questionologist, right? There's a way and a method of asking questions, making sure you don't frame just yes, no sorts of questions, but open-ended questions. So the first thing is to be able to wonder. There's literally nothing bad that follows the phrase, I wonder what if, I wonder what would happen. Like, there's nothing bad that can follow that phrase, right? So inquiry is really important, and being able to see a world that doesn't exist, being able to, even if you don't say it out loud, to ask yourself the what if questions, the why questions, the how could I do this questions. It also can be quite terrifying, but I like to say that if you feel 50% exhilarated and 50% terrified, you need to leap, because the terror keeps you grounded. The terror ensures that you dot your I's and you cross your T's. And the exhilaration keeps you optimistic and buoyant. And you need both. There goes that hybridity in me again, right?
Love it.
But both are really essential. The other I, and these are not in any particular order, is to be improvisational in order to imagine a better future, a world that doesn't yet exist. And improvisation is about being adaptive, it's about being self-organizing, it's about being emergent. Those three things I just said, adaptive, self-organizing, emergent, all, by the way, are descriptors for complex systems. All complex systems are adaptive, self-organizing, and emergent. Jazz is a complex system. Improvisation is a complex system. Creativity is a complex system, right? So any ways that we can allow ourselves to be more experimental in small itty bitty ways, like don't follow the recipe when you're cooking, get lost on purpose, go a different way. I mean, we haven't been driving to work, but go a different way to wherever it is that you go, right? And these are ways that we begin to spark neural synapses in our brains that require us to be a bit more adaptive, a bit more self-organizing. And then the intuition piece, I already referenced that one of the things we know that Harriet Tubman used to navigate her way and help others to be liberated from slavery in our country was her dreams. Not only did she use astronomy and the stars, she understood the land and the terrain, she understood weather patterns, but she used her dreams as well. And I think of intuition as pattern recognition. It's that nudge. It's that knowing that I should go left and not right. I should work with this person and not that person, right? Sometimes I call intuition brain feelings. A lot of people describe intuition as knowing without knowing. So when we need to create a future that does not yet exist, we must get quiet and still, and we must pay attention to that intuition, because it is like a muscle or a sonar. And by that, I mean that the more we use it, the stronger it gets, the louder and clearer it gets. And the more we ignore it, the flabbier it gets, the dimmer it gets. And, in my own personal life, the work that I do now is a product of imagining a world that did not exist. I mean, I worked really hard to be a professor. As I already shared, I earned a PhD while working full time. It was my dream job in so many ways. I loved what I did until I didn't anymore. And then that terrified me. I was like, uh-oh. And it was my intuition that really required me to pause and take stock and begin to imagine a world that didn't exist. And at first it was quiet questions to myself that I was afraid to say out loud. Questions that the questions first were self-reflexive questions where I was questioning, like check-ins for myself. How are you really feeling? Are you really enjoying this? Are you really kind of wishing that this side hustle that you've been doing, that was more of the ways you were spending your time? And then it became these very exploratory, envisioning types of questions. So even my job title, creativity strategist, I made that shit up. I made up creativity strategist because I had the opportunity. Okay, what are you gonna call this thing that you do? So I realized it was it described what I loved and what I was really good at. And that was the mashup. And I had to practice looking at myself in the mirror, this is back in the time we were like going to cocktail parties and events and conferences, and say, hi, my name is Natalie Nixon. I'm a creativity strategist. And repeat that 10 times until it rolled off my tongue, because it didn't right away. I felt I would like get tongue tied and like, oh, that sounds weird. But you know, all of a sudden it's like, yeah, that is exactly who I am. But it starts with questions. It starts with being experimental, improvising, and really having the courage to act on your intuition.
So I wanted, I have a follow-up question for you. I want to put it out there that those of you who are with us tonight, if you have questions, throw them into the chat and we'll have an opportunity to have Natalie answer a few of them. So let's just take this full circle. So this approach of wonder and rigor, your move from being a professor where you started to wonder, is this really the work for me? And the rigor of figuring out what was next, you use this tool that I just adore, and I'm going to just start using in my life for everything, which is making your list of things you love and things you loathe. And I just
actually love loathe sounds better, but actually it was loathe on the left hand side and love, the loathe love audit.
I think that's just I mean, that can apply to so many things in our lives.
Yes. Yeah. And it started with a blank piece of paper and a pen at my kitchen table. I drew a line down the center, and on the left, I just did a brain dump and listed all the things that, I mean, like I despised about my work, that I that kept me up at night, and like I didn't want to have to deal with. And it was like, ugh, don't want to have to do that. And then on the right hand side, everything that I loved, I mean, adored about being a professor and teaching and doing the work that I did. And when it was out there on the piece of paper, all of a sudden, when I really started looking at the right hand side of the piece of paper, all the stuff that I adored and loved, this reframing happened for me. And I thought, oh, I could still do the stuff on the right hand side of the paper. It's just not called being a professor anymore. Now, my mother, after I resigned, the first year, she would ask me about twice a month, are you sure you did the right thing? Are you okay? And then year two, oh God, year two, it got down like every other month, about 6 times a year. She'd ask me, so how are you feeling? You think you did the right thing? Yes. Year 3, twice a year. Now she's given up. She gets it. Right. But yeah, it's building a world that does not yet exist and may not make sense to a lot of people around you, maybe to a couple people around you. And you increasingly just have this clarity, and it helps to extrapolate it, put it out there in front of you, and look at it for what it is. The other thing that I did, Lauren, is I gave myself a miniature retreat. And when I said I'm going to give myself a retreat, now, first of all, I was a professor, so I had the luxury of having a really reduced workload over the summer, right? So most people don't have this. So that first, I'll admit, like that was nice. I had the summer to really kind of decompress. But I decided I want to give myself a retreat, and I didn't know if that was going to be a day in a hotel somewhere. I didn't know if it was going to be a long weekend. And I was actually having lunch with another alumna from where Lauren and I went to college at Vassar, and older than us, but someone's just become a real dear friend to me. And I was just kind of like telling her, like, this is where I'm at, I'm confused, I'm giving myself a retreat. And she's like, well, like, how long do you think? And I said, I don't know, hopefully a weekend. It'd be nice if it could be a week. And she happened to have a beautiful home, additional home in Virginia, in Assateague Bay in Chincoteague, Virginia. And she said, you could stay with me. I'm just going to be practicing my flute every day. Why don't you just come and hang out? And in that week, she had attached to her home this pier that there's beautiful grasses, in this bay. And every day it was like rinse, repeat. I'd wake up, have some morning coffee. I had a journal. I had these like self-help books. I would walk out barefoot to the end of the dock. And for me, water is just always this incredible touch point in my life. Water is very healing for me. It helps me to like be very expansive. And I would journal, I would ask questions, I would follow these little worksheets, I would find these self-help books, I would cry, I would nap, we'd go for lunch, I go back out to the pier, we cook dinner, sleep, wake up, rinse, repeat. And at the end of the week, I didn't feel like anything had shifted. I was like, well, that was the retreat. I guess that was helpful. And it's only retrospectively that I realize how important that was. So for any of you who are kind of at this inflection point, it doesn't, I don't think it matters if it's a day that you can afford, if it's a weekend that you can afford, if it is a month, whatever it is, take the time to pause and to be with yourself and to ask yourself those hard, uncomfortable questions and maybe stare at a blank piece of paper. But give yourself that time. It does, no pun intended, wonders for really figuring out what's next.
That sounds like an amazing retreat. Can I have her phone number? Just flash it up on the screen. Well, so Jonathan's asking, can you explain how you do your wonder breaks? And I think this is kind of the nature of the question is like, is it, maybe the ones that you just take during the day or what that you recommend?
Yeah. So first, I'm launching a course this August called the Wonder Rigor Lab. And it's really, I prototyped it in the winter as a live group coaching class. And that iteration, I called it Your Creativity Leap. And it's really about helping people get unstuck and applying some of the principles from the book, The Creativity Leap, but also my own creativity hacks. And what I really try to do is equip people with some of the basic tenets and principles, and then try it on for yourself. Like, what does that look like for you and your life, your version of that? But for me, wonder breaks, it involves daydreaming, it involves walking. I'm very kinesthetic. So I need to move and that's how things clear out for me. So, the Japanese have a whole word in their language, which we translated as forest bathing, where you immerse yourself in nature. We now know, whether you're by the ocean or in the woods, that, the way the sunlight filters through the chlorophyll affects the release of oxytocin, and serotonin. They're good hormones. And our feet breaking against the soil releases certain bacteria that when we inhale that, it's very healing and healthy for us. So whatever for you is going to help you pause, give you a sense of awe, allow you to dream, make that up. And design that into your life. And there's another phrase I use are rigor sprints. So I posted this on LinkedIn. I recently learned that there's something called the Pomodoro method, which is very similar to what I call rigor sprints. The guy in the 80s started this idea of you work in 25-minute increments, super focus, no bells and whistles or alarms going off on your phone and your laptop, and then you take a 5-minute break, and then you go back. And that's how I approach rigor sprints. I also ran track in high school, and when you're practicing sprints, you do full out, and then you rest, and then you do full out, and then you rest. But there's that recovery that you need, and then that pushing of yourself. So whatever rigor sprint is for you, in a way that you can get in the zone, be really deeply focused. If it's about practicing fundamentals, if it's about finally reading a really hard article, but that will help you understand something that you're working on, those are examples of rigor moments, rigor sprints. However it makes sense for you to define it, interpret it.
Love it. I want to just do a quick time check, Tom, make sure we're not all going to disappear at 7 o'clock in a cloud of smoke. So one question for you, Natalie, before we let everyone go. Well, first of all, before we let everyone go, make sure you do click on that link I put in the chat so you can have an opportunity to download the Wonder Rigor tip sheet. And I believe Natalie will be giving away a book to one of you.
I'm giving everyone 24 hours to download the link that's in the chat. It's 16 tips to amplify wonder and rigor in your life and work. And then we will randomly select one person. Oh, yay. Who will receive a signed copy of the Creativity Leap from me. So please definitely check out the Wonder Rigor tip sheet.
And it's a good tip sheet. Okay, so I'd like to wrap up with one question, which is I love asking at the end of all of my conversations, which is an advice question. What's the best advice that you've ever been given about how to get buy-in for what seems like a totally outrageous idea?
The worst thing that will happen is that you'll wind up back where you are. And what I mean by that, this was something, I always say my father gave me my cojones, because my father was the supreme optimist. He was the person I could go to with my harebrained ideas and schemes. He would be like, try it. The worst thing that can happen is you'll just end up where you are. And that's not bad, and that's a variation, or that's a corollary to other advice that my parents gave me, which is to follow your heart, right? But it's actually a much more efficient way to live when we follow our heart. It might be harder in the moment. It might be a little more lonely, but gosh, is it much more efficient? Because how many midlife crises are full of people who finally realize, okay, it's time for me to follow my heart. Enough of the golden handcuffs, right? It's all about now being true to myself and going for it. So just put it in perspective that the worst thing that can happen if you don't show up, speak out, try it, is that you'll just be where you are, which is not regressive. It's just okay, and you will learn something.
Yay, Natalie's dad.
Yay, Frederick Douglass Weathers. That's right.
Thank you. Well, Natalie, thank you so much for joining me in this conversation tonight. I learned a lot. I hope that everyone here also got something out of it. Thank you all so much for coming. This was really fun. And thank you to the Battery for hosting.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, the Battery. Thanks everyone for joining tonight.
All right. So download that tip sheet. I'll give one more plug for Natalie. And this book is really, I have been obsessing over it, and I definitely recommend it. Worth a read. And thank you all so much for your time. I hope you have a very creative evening, week, month, year. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Lauren. Thanks, everybody.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.